Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Meridian and watched the stars streak past through the viewport. His ship was heading toward the most important meeting in human history, and he knew it might be their last chance to stay in the galaxy. The message from Earth still played in his mind like a broken recording that would not stop. Dr. Lisa Hayes walked up beside him, holding a datapad in her shaking hands. She had been studying alien biology for 20 years, but today, she looked more worried than he had ever seen her. The communication from the Galactic Council was clear and simple. Humanity had 30 days to prove they belonged in the Federation, or they would be kicked out of all protected space. Captain, the numbers do not look good for us, Lisa said while reviewing her notes. Every other species in the Federation has something special that makes them valuable. The Zephyrians can read minds and talk to each other without speaking. The Nexari build computers that can think faster than entire planets. The Korthok are so strong they can crush steel with their bare hands. Jake nodded and turned away from the viewport. He had been thinking about the same problem since they received the ultimatum 3 days ago. Humans were the newest members of the Federation, and everyone treated them like children who did not understand how the real galaxy worked. Most aliens saw humans as a weird accident that somehow learned to travel between stars without being smart enough to deserve it. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Blake joined them near the navigation console. His uniform was perfectly pressed as always, but his face showed the stress they were all feeling. Ryan had spent his whole career studying alien military tactics, and he knew human weapons were like throwing rocks at armored vehicles compared to what other species could build. Maybe we should show them our military history, Ryan suggested, but his voice did not sound confident. Humans have won wars against impossible odds before. We beat the Nazis and survived 2 world wars and came back stronger each time. Lisa shook her head and pulled up holographic displays showing Federation military technology. Ryan, their worst weapons could turn Earth into space dust in minutes. Our best battleships are like paper boats compared to what they build. Military strength is not going to impress anyone. Chief Engineer Amy Parker climbed up from the lower deck where she had been checking the ship systems. Her hands were covered in grease and her hair was tied back in a messy ponytail. Amy could fix almost anything that broke on a human ship, but she knew their technology was centuries behind what the aliens used every day. What about our engineering? Amy asked while wiping her hands on a cloth. Humans are good at building things that work even when they should not work. We make machines that keep running when they are held together with spare parts and hope. Jake wanted to agree with her, but he had seen what alien engineers could create. The Nexari built cities that floated in space without any visible support. The Zephyrians grew their ships from living crystal that repaired itself when damaged. Human engineering looked primitive and clumsy next to such wonders. Communications. Officer Danny Walsh looked up from his station where he had been monitoring galactic news feeds. His job was to keep track of what was happening across the Federation, but lately most of the news about humans was not good. Several species had openly questioned why humans were allowed to join the Federation in the first place. The news is getting worse, Danny reported while adjusting his headset. More council members are saying humans contribute nothing to galactic civilization. High Chancellor Vextar gave a speech yesterday calling us cosmic accidents who got lucky with faster-than-light travel. The bridge fell quiet except for the soft humming of the ship engines. Everyone knew that Vextar was the most powerful member of the Galactic Council. If he had decided humans did not belong in the Federation, then their chances of changing his mind were very small. Jake walked back to his command chair and sat down heavily. The weight of representing all humanity pressed down on his shoulders. Like a mountain, every human colony and every person on Earth was depending on his crew to find a way to prove their worth to beings who saw them as inferior in every way that mattered. "Sir, we will reach Nexus Prime in 6 hours, the helmsman reported from his station. "All alien ships in the area are keeping their distance from us. I think they already know why we are here." Lisa came over and handed Jake the datapad she had been studying. The screen showed population numbers for human colonies across the galaxy. 50 million people lived on worlds outside the solar system, and they would all become refugees if humanity was expelled from the Federation. Earth itself would be cut off from the rest of the galaxy and forced back into isolation. "There has to be something we can do," Amy said while looking around at her crewmates. "Humans have always found ways to survive when everyone said we could not. We went from caves to starships in just a few thousand years." Ryan crossed his arms and stared at the tactical display. "The problem is we are not competing against ourselves this time. We are trying to prove we deserve to stand next to species that have been traveling the stars for millions of years." They see us as babies playing with toys we do not understand. Danny adjusted his communications equipment and turned toward the group. I have been listening to alien broadcasts for years, and I noticed something interesting. They never really talk to each other the way humans do. Each species stays in their own groups and follows their own rules without much mixing. Jake looked up at Danny with curiosity. It was true that humans seemed to be the only species that actively tried to learn from others and adapt their ideas. Most aliens acted like their way of doing things was the only correct way and everyone else was wrong or inferior. Keep monitoring those broadcasts, Jake ordered while standing up from his chair. Maybe there is something we can learn about how they think. We have 6 hours to figure out what makes humans special, or we are going home in disgrace. The crew returned to their stations as the UES Meridian continued toward Nexus Prime. Outside the viewport, the stars seemed colder and more distant than usual. Soon they would face the greatest challenge in human history, and none of them knew if they were smart enough or strong enough or special enough to succeed. The council chambers on Nexus Prime stretched out like a vast cathedral made of living crystal and floating metal. Jake Morrison had never seen anything so beautiful or so intimidating in his life. Hundreds of alien beings filled the curved seats that rose up toward a domed ceiling covered in swirling patterns of light. Each species sat in their own section, and none of them looked happy to see the human delegation. High Chancellor Vextar stood at the center podium with his tall, thin body, wrapped in robes that seemed to shift colors like oil on water. His large black eyes had no pupils, but Jake could feel the Zephyrian leader studying him with thoughts that moved faster than human minds could follow. Around the chamber, other council members waited in silence that felt heavy and final. Humans of Earth, Vextar spoke without moving his mouth, and his words appeared directly inside their heads. You have requested the right to remain in our Federation despite contributing nothing of value to galactic civilization. We have decided to offer you one final opportunity to prove your worth. Lisa Hayes stood beside Jake and tried not to show how nervous she felt. The alien minds around them pressed against her thoughts like an ocean of intelligence that could drown her if she let it. She had studied Zephyrian telepathy for years, but experiencing it directly was completely different from reading about it. In books, we present to you the Gordian scenario, Vextar continued, while holographic displays materialized in the air above them. This theoretical crisis has challenged the greatest minds in the galaxy for over 3,000 years. If you can solve what we cannot, then perhaps humans do have something unique to offer. The hologram showed a star system with 5 different planets orbiting a dying red giant. Each world was home to a different alien species, and all of them were running out of time as their sun grew larger and hotter. Jake could see immediately that this was not just about moving populations to new worlds. The display showed complex relationships between the species that made simple solutions impossible. Ryan Blake studied the tactical information while his military training kicked into action. The 5 species were locked in conflicts that went back thousands of years. The thermal dwellers needed extreme heat to survive, while the ice builders could only live in freezing conditions. The gas swimmers required toxic atmospheres that would kill the other species instantly. The Nexari quantum computers have calculated 47 trillion possible solutions, announced Prime Calculix Zenth from his floating platform. The machine being looked like a collection of geometric shapes held together by crackling energy. Every scenario results in the extinction of at least 3 species. Mathematics proves that no optimal solution exists. Amy Parker examined the engineering data and felt her heart sink. Each species had different technological needs, and their equipment could not work together. The thermal dwellers used fusion reactors that would melt ice builder cities. The gas swimmers needed environmental systems that were poisonous to everyone else. Moving them all to new worlds would require resources that did not exist. Our collective consciousness has meditated on this problem for centuries, added Mariah, the Zephyrian telepath, whose voice echoed with the thoughts of millions. Every path we explore leads to suffering and death. The telepathic networks of 5 species cannot find harmony between such different needs. Danny Walsh listened to the alien discussions and noticed something strange about how they communicated. Each species spoke only about their own analysis and their own methods. The Nexari talked about calculations and the Zephyrians discussed telepathic consensus, but none of them seemed to be actually listening to the others. Or Chief Gruul of the Korthok stood up from his massive stone chair and his voice boomed across the chamber like thunder. We have simulated every possible military solution. Superior force cannot solve this crisis. Even our greatest warriors cannot fight the laws of physics and biology. Victory through combat is impossible. Jake looked around at his crew and saw the same realization in their eyes. The aliens had given them a problem that the smartest computers, and the most powerful telepaths and the strongest warriors in the galaxy could not solve. They were being set up to fail in front of the entire Federation as proof that humans did not belong among the stars. "You have 7 standard days to present your solution," Vexter announced with satisfaction in his mental voice. "We will provide you with all the data our species have gathered over the millennia. You may use any resources available on Nexus Prime. When you fail as we have failed, then you will understand that some problems have no answers." The human delegation was escorted to quarters in the lower levels of the Council complex. Their rooms were comfortable but clearly designed for visiting species that were expected to leave soon. Jake gathered his crew in the main conference room and spread out the data files the aliens had provided. The amount of information was overwhelming. "This is impossible," Ryan said while reviewing military assessments that covered thousands of pages. "They want us to solve a problem that quantum computers cannot handle. We do not have telepathic powers or superior technology. How are 5 humans supposed to succeed where entire civilizations have failed?" Lisa was studying biological reports about the 5 species in the scenario. Each group had evolved on completely different worlds with different gravity and different atmospheres and different food sources. Their basic needs contradicted each other in ways that seemed impossible to resolve. "Look at this," she said, while pointing to genetic analysis charts. "The thermal dwellers breathe sulfur compounds that are deadly poison to the ice builders. The gas swimmers absorb radiation that would kill the other species in minutes. Even if we could move them all to new planets, we could never find worlds that would support such different life forms." Amy was examining the technological requirements and shaking her head in frustration. "Their machines are not compatible with each other. The power sources that run thermal dweller cities would destroy ice builder equipment. The gas swimmer technology only works in toxic environments that no one else can survive." Danny had been listening to recordings of previous attempts to solve the Gordian scenario. Thousands of the galaxy's best minds had worked on the problem over the centuries. Every approach had been tried, and every solution had failed. Mathematical optimization led to extinction. Telepathic consensus could not bridge such different needs. Military force could not change the basic requirements of biology and physics. "Maybe that is the point," Jake said quietly while looking at his crew. "They do not expect us to solve this problem. They expect us to fail publicly so they can justify throwing humanity out of the Federation. This whole exercise is designed to humiliate us." The room fell silent as the crew considered their situation. They were trapped on an alien world surrounded by beings who wanted them to fail. The future of humanity depended on solving a puzzle that had stumped the galaxy for thousands of years. Every logical approach had already been tried and found wanting. "Sir, what if we are thinking about this wrong?" Danny suggested while adjusting his communication equipment. "What if the problem is not really about finding the perfect solution? What if it is about something else entirely?" Jake looked up with interest. Danny had always been good at noticing things that others missed. His job was to listen to alien communications and understand what they really meant beyond the words they used. "The aliens keep talking about optimal solutions and perfect answers," Danny continued. "But what if perfect is the enemy of good enough? What if they have been so focused on finding the ideal solution that they missed other possibilities?" Ryan frowned and crossed his arms. "What other possibilities could there be? Either the 5 species survive or they do not. Either we can move them to safety or we cannot. The mathematics are clear about what resources are available." Amy nodded. "In agreement. The engineering constraints are absolute. You cannot change the basic laws of physics just by thinking about them differently. The species have needs that contradict each other, and there are not enough resources to satisfy everyone." But Jake was beginning to understand what Danny meant. The aliens approached problems through their dominant strengths. The Nexari used pure logic and mathematical optimization. The Zephyrians sought telepathic consensus and harmony. The applied overwhelming force and superior strategy. Each species had one way of thinking, and they could not imagine solutions that required different approaches. "Maybe that is exactly what we need to figure out," Jake said while looking around at his diverse crew. "Not how to outcalculate the Nexari or outthink the Zephyrians, but how to approach this problem in a way that none of them have tried before." The human crew had been working on the Gordian scenario for 3 days, and they were no closer to a solution than when they started. Jake Morrison sat in the conference room surrounded by data displays and calculation charts that seemed to mock Their efforts, every approach they tried led to the same dead ends that had stopped the aliens for thousands of years. Lisa Hayes pushed back from the table and rubbed her tired eyes. She had been studying the biological needs of the 5 species, until the numbers blurred together into meaningless patterns. The thermal dwellers needed temperatures that would kill the ice builders instantly. The gas swimmers required toxic environments that would poison everyone else. No matter how she arranged the data, the basic contradictions remained unchanged. "This is hopeless," Ryan Blake said while staring at military logistics reports. "We have tried every combination of resource allocation and evacuation timing. There are simply not enough ships to move 5 entire species before their star goes supernova. Even with perfect coordination, we can only save maybe 40% of the total population." Amy Parker had filled 3 whiteboards with engineering calculations, but none of them led anywhere useful. The technology requirements for supporting such different life forms were impossible to meet with available resources. Building habitats for species that needed completely different environments would take centuries and cost more than the entire Federation budget. Danny Walsh looked up from his communication station, where he had been reviewing historical records of previous solution attempts. "I have been reading about all the different approaches that failed over the years. The Nexari tried to optimize resource distribution with quantum computing. The Zephyrians attempted to find telepathic harmony between the species. The Korthak planned military operations to force cooperation. Every method follows the same pattern." Jake turned toward Danny with interest. Sometimes the communications officer noticed things that everyone else missed, because his job was to listen rather than solve problems directly. "What pattern do you see, Danny?" "Each species approaches the scenario using their greatest strength," Danny explained while pulling up holographic displays. "The Nexari use pure mathematics because that is what they are best at. The Zephyrians rely on telepathic consensus because that is how they make all their decisions. The Korthak apply military force because that is their solution to every problem." Lisa nodded slowly as she began to understand what Danny meant. So they are all trying to solve the problem using the same methods that make them successful in other situations. But what if this particular problem requires a different kind of thinking entirely? Amy stood up and began pacing around the room. Her engineering mind was starting to see possibilities that had been hidden by traditional approaches. "In human engineering, we have a saying that if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. Maybe the aliens are so focused on using their specialized tools that they cannot see other ways to approach the situation." Ryan was still skeptical about finding solutions where advanced alien minds had failed. "But what makes us different? We do not have quantum computers or telepathic powers or superior military technology. How can we succeed where they failed if we are weaker in every measurable way?" Jake got up from his chair and walked over to the viewport that looked out over the alien city. Nexus Prime was a marvel of different architectural styles blended together in ways that should not work but somehow did. Zephyrian crystal spires grew next to Nexari geometric structures, while Korthak stone fortresses provided foundations for the more delicate designs. "Maybe that is exactly the point," Jake said while watching alien beings move through the streets below. "We are not specialists like they are. Humans are generalists who adapt and improvise and combine different approaches. We do not have one dominant strength that defines how we think about everything." Lisa felt something click in her mind, like a puzzle piece falling into place. "When I was studying alien biology, I noticed that each species has evolved to be perfect for their specific environment. The thermal dwellers are completely adapted to high heat. The ice builders cannot survive outside freezing conditions. But humans evolved on Earth, where we had to deal with many different environments and challenges." Amy stopped pacing and turned toward the group with excitement growing in her voice. "That is why human engineering looks primitive to them. We build things that are not optimized for any specific situation but can work in many different conditions. Our technology is flexible and adaptable rather than perfectly efficient." Danny was pulling up historical records of human achievements and displaying them on the wall screens. "Look at how humans have always solved impossible problems. We did not beat the Nazis by being stronger or smarter than them. We won by combining different strategies and adapting when our original plans failed." Jake began to see the pattern that connected all of human history. We survived ice ages and plagues and wars, not because we were the fastest or strongest species on Earth, but because we could work together and find creative solutions when traditional methods did not work. Ryan was starting to understand, but he still had doubts about applying human methods to galactic problems. "So you are saying we should approach the Gordian scenario like humans instead of trying to copy alien thinking?" But what does that actually mean in practical terms? Lisa was already working with the biological data in completely new ways. Instead of trying to find optimal solutions for each species separately, she began looking at how they might adapt to less than perfect conditions. What if we stop trying to give each species exactly what they need and start looking at what they could learn to live with? Amy joined her at the data display and began modifying engineering calculations. Human settlements have always succeeded by making do with whatever resources were available rather than waiting for ideal conditions. Maybe these alien species could do the same if they were willing to be flexible. Danny was reviewing communication records between the 5 species in the scenario. I noticed something interesting about how they talk to each other. They never actually communicate directly. Each group sends formal messages through intermediaries, but they do not have real conversations where they listen to each other. Jake felt pieces of understanding coming together in his mind. The aliens had been treating the Gordian scenario as a mathematical optimization problem or a telepathic consensus challenge or a military logistics exercise. But maybe it was really a communication problem disguised as a resource crisis. What if the 5 species are not fighting over resources because there are not enough to go around? Jake said slowly as the idea developed. What if they are fighting because they do not understand each other and they are afraid of losing what makes them unique? Lisa looked up from her biological analysis with growing excitement. That would explain why mathematical solutions do not work. You cannot calculate your way out of fear and mistrust. And telepathic consensus fails because the species are not willing to share their thoughts with beings they see as threats. Amy was redesigning habitat requirements based on compromise rather than optimization. If the species were willing to accept less than perfect living conditions, they could share resources and living spaces. The technology exists to create environments that would not be ideal for anyone but would be acceptable to everyone. Ryan studied military reports about conflicts between the 5 species and found evidence that supported their new theory. Most of their wars started over misunderstandings and cultural differences rather than actual resource shortages. They fight because they think the others want to destroy their way of life. Danny was examining communication patterns and discovering that the species had been talking past each other for thousands of years. They send messages, but they do not really listen to the responses. Each group assumes they know what the others want without actually asking them directly. Jake gathered his crew around the central display where all their new analysis was taking shape. For the first time since they arrived on Nexus Prime, they had something that looked like hope instead of just another mathematical dead end. So here is what we know, Jake said while organizing their discoveries. The Gordian scenario is not really about resource optimization or military logistics or telepathic harmony. It is about 5 different species who have been assuming they understand each other without ever having honest conversations about what they actually need and want. Lisa nodded enthusiastically. And humans are uniquely qualified to help with this kind of problem because we have always been good at bringing different groups together and finding compromise solutions that everyone can live with. Amy was already sketching out engineering plans for shared habitats that would work for multiple species. We do not need to find perfect solutions. We just need to find solutions that are good enough for everyone to survive while they figure out better long-term arrangements. Ryan was developing security protocols that focused on cooperation rather than military dominance. Instead of using force to impose solutions, we can use human diplomatic methods to help the species negotiate agreements that protect everyone's interests. The Great Council chamber fell silent as Jake Morrison and his crew walked toward the central presentation platform. 5 days had passed since they were given the Gordian scenario, and now hundreds of alien beings waited to see how badly the humans would fail. High Chancellor Vexter sat in his elevated position with the satisfaction of someone who already knew the outcome of a rigged game. Lisa Hayes carried a datapad that contained their analysis, but her hands were steady now instead of shaking with nervousness. She had spent the last 2 days discovering things about alien biology that the aliens themselves had never considered, not because she was smarter than their scientists, but because she approached the problem from a completely different direction. Honored council members, Jake began, while the translation systems converted his words into forms that each species could understand. We have studied the Gordian scenario as requested, and we have reached some interesting conclusions. But before we present our findings, we want to ask a simple question. What does it mean to solve a problem? Prime Calculix Zenth responded immediately. With mechanical precision, to solve a problem means to find the optimal solution that maximizes benefit while minimizing cost. Mathematical analysis provides exact answers based on quantifiable variables and logical parameters. Mirai, the Zephyrian telepath, offered a different perspective with her voice echoing across mental networks. Problem solving requires achieving consensus among all affected parties through telepathic harmony and shared understanding of universal truth and collective needs. War Chief Gruel of the Korthok stood up, and his massive form cast shadows across the chamber floor. Solutions come through decisive action and superior strategy. Victory belongs to those with the strength and courage to impose order upon chaos, through overwhelming force and unbreakable will. Jake nodded respectfully to each speaker, then turned back toward the assembled council. Those are all valid approaches that have served your species well for millions of years. But humans have discovered that sometimes the best solutions are not optimal or harmonious or decisive. Sometimes the best solutions are just good enough for everyone to live with. A murmur of confusion passed through the alien observers. The concept of deliberately choosing imperfect solutions seemed to contradict everything they understood about logical problem solving. Several council members exchanged glances that suggested the humans were about to embarrass themselves publicly. Lisa stepped forward and activated holographic displays showing biological analysis of the 5 species in the Gordian scenario. Studied the life requirements for each group, and we discovered something that previous analyses missed. Every species focused on what they needed to survive perfectly, but no one asked what they needed to survive adequately. The displays showed environmental tolerance ranges that extended far beyond the narrow parameters that previous studies had used. The thermal dwellers could survive in much cooler temperatures than their preferred heat levels. The ice builders could adapt to warmer conditions if they had time to adjust gradually. Perfect optimization assumes that anything less than ideal conditions will result in failure. Lisa continued while the alien scientists studied her data with growing surprise. But biological systems are naturally adaptable. Life finds ways to survive in environments that should be impossible according to mathematical models. Amy Parker took over the presentation and began showing engineering designs that looked crude compared to alien technology, but had one crucial advantage. They were flexible enough to work under many different conditions instead of being optimized for specific requirements. Human engineering is not about building perfect machines, Amy explained while rotating 3-dimensional models in the air above them. We build things that can be modified and repaired and adapted when conditions change. Our technology works because it accepts that failure is normal, and plans for it, instead of assuming everything will go according to plan. The habitat designs she displayed could support multiple species by providing different environmental zones within the same structures, instead of trying to create perfect conditions for each group. Separately, they offered acceptable conditions that everyone could adapt to with some effort and compromise. Ryan Blake presented military logistics that focused on cooperation rather than conquest. His strategies assumed that the 5 species would work together to solve their common problem, instead of competing for limited resources through superior force. Human military history shows that the strongest solutions come from combining different capabilities rather than trying to dominate through pure power, Ryan said while showing examples of successful alliances between former enemies. When groups work together, they can accomplish things that none of them could achieve alone, even with overwhelming advantages. Danny Walsh demonstrated communication protocols that would allow direct conversation between species that had been sending formal messages through intermediaries for thousands of years. His systems were designed to encourage real dialogue instead of just broadcasting predetermined positions. The 5 species in the Gordian scenario have been assuming they understand each other, without ever having honest conversations about what they actually want, Danny explained while playing recordings of failed diplomatic exchanges. Humans have learned that most conflicts can be resolved when people start listening to each other instead of just waiting for their turn to speak. High Chancellor Vexter leaned forward with his large black eyes focused intently on the human presentation. You'll propose deliberate imperfection as a solution to complex optimization problems. This contradicts fundamental principles of logical analysis and efficient resource allocation. Jake smiled and nodded toward the Zephyrian leader. Yes, sir, that is exactly what we propose. Human logic incorporates contradiction and uncertainty as natural parts of existence. We do not try to eliminate problems. We try to find ways to live with them while working toward better solutions over time. Prime Calculix Zenth processed this information with visible confusion. Mathematical models demonstrate that suboptimal solutions lead to cascading failures and systematic collapse. Deliberate inefficiency cannot produce superior outcomes to Optimized calculations. Lisa responded by showing biological examples from Earth where seemingly inefficient systems outperformed optimized ones when conditions changed unexpectedly. Quantum computers can calculate perfect solutions for static problems, but biological systems have to deal with constant change and uncertainty. Flexibility often matters more than optimization. Amy added engineering examples of human technology that succeeded precisely because it was not perfectly designed. Our machines work in conditions they were never designed for because we build in redundancy and workarounds. Alien technology often fails catastrophically when faced with unexpected variables. War Chief Gruel crossed his massive arms and glared at the human delegation. You advocate weakness and compromise instead of strength and victory. Such strategies lead to defeat and submission to superior forces. Ryan met the Korthok leader's gaze without flinching. Human military history includes many examples where strategic retreat and regrouping led to eventual victory over apparently superior enemies. Sometimes the strongest action is knowing when not to fight. The council chamber erupted in discussions, as alien beings tried to process concepts that challenged their fundamental assumptions about how problems should be solved. The Nexari argued about mathematical paradoxes while the Zephyrians debated telepathic implications of accepting imperfect solutions. Jake waited for the noise to die down, then continued with the most important part of their presentation. We are not saying that your methods are wrong. Optimization and consensus and decisive action are all valuable tools for solving problems. But humans have learned that some problems require multiple tools working together. He activated a new display that showed their integrated approach to the Gordian scenario. Instead of trying to find one perfect solution, they had developed 5 different approaches that could be combined and modified as conditions changed. We propose that the 5 species begin by talking to each other directly about what they actually need instead of what they think they need, Jake said while showing communication protocols. Then they can work together to design flexible habitats that everyone can adapt to while they search for better long-term solutions. Lisa added biological adaptation strategies that would help each species adjust to less than perfect conditions. Amy provided engineering plans for modular habitats that could be reconfigured as needs changed. Ryan offered security arrangements based on mutual cooperation rather than military dominance. Danny demonstrated how improved communication would allow the species to coordinate their efforts and resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than force. Each element of their solution was imperfect when examined separately, but together they created possibilities that none of the alien approaches had discovered. The Gordian scenario cannot be solved through pure optimization or telepathic consensus, or military strategy alone, Jake concluded, while looking around at the assembled council members. It requires the kind of flexible thinking that humans have developed through dealing with uncertainty and change, and contradiction throughout our history. Something unprecedented began happening in the council chambers after the human presentation ended. For the first time in galactic history, alien beings from different species started asking each other questions instead of simply stating their positions and waiting for others to agree or disagree. A young Nexari observer named Quex floated toward the human delegation with geometric patterns of light flickering across his crystalline surface. His mechanical voice carried curiosity instead of the usual calculating certainty that characterized his species. Humans Morrison and Hayes Quex said, while his quantum processors analyzed their biological data in real time. Your concept of deliberately accepting suboptimal solutions contradicts mathematical principles yet produces functional outcomes. How do you determine when imperfection is preferable to optimization? Lisa smiled and pulled up examples from Earth's ecosystem management. On our homeworld, we learned that trying to create perfect environments often led to ecological collapse. Natural systems work because they include inefficiencies and redundancies that provide stability when conditions change unexpectedly. Added historical examples of human societies that succeeded through adaptation rather than optimization. Our cities and governments and technologies work not because they are perfectly designed, but because they can be modified when circumstances require different approaches. Quex processed this information and began displaying calculations that incorporated uncertainty variables instead of assuming perfect knowledge. His quantum matrices flickered with new patterns as he explored mathematical models that deliberately included imperfection as a design feature. Mirai, the Zephyrian telepath, approached from another direction with her consciousness touching the edges of human thoughts. The telepathic contact felt different from the usual Zephyrian mental intrusion because she was listening rather than broadcasting predetermined conclusions. Your minds function without telepathic consensus yet achieve coordination through verbal communication, she observed while her mental voice carried genuine puzzlement. How do humans make collective decisions when individual thoughts remain separate and potentially contradictory? Danny Walsh activated his communication equipment and showed examples of human democratic processes and negotiation techniques. We have learned that good group decisions often come from combining different viewpoints rather than trying to achieve perfect agreement. Disagreement can be useful if people listen to each other respectfully. Amy demonstrated engineering teams working together despite having different specialties and perspectives. Human projects succeed when people with different skills contribute their expertise while accepting that others know things they do not understand. Mirai began experimenting with telepathic communication methods that allowed individual thoughts to remain distinct while still sharing information. Instead of seeking the mental harmony that Zephyrians usually required, she started exploring how diversity of thought might produce better solutions than consensus. War. Chief Gruul had been watching these exchanges with growing confusion and interest. The massive Korthok warrior was accustomed to solving problems through superior strength and decisive action, but the human approach suggested that there might be alternatives to overwhelming force. Human Blake Gruul rumbled while his stone-like features showed unusual uncertainty. Your military strategies accept retreat and compromise as acceptable outcomes. How does such weakness lead to victory against superior enemies? Ryan pulled up historical examples of asymmetric warfare where smaller forces defeated larger ones through flexibility and adaptation. Korthak military doctrine assumes that superior force always wins. But human experience shows that the ability to change tactics often matters more than raw power. He showed battles where disciplined armies lost to guerrilla fighters who refused to engage according to conventional rules. Sometimes the strongest strategy is avoiding direct confrontation until conditions favor success. Gruul studied these examples with his warrior mind, trying to understand concepts that challenged everything he believed about combat and victory. Slowly he began to see merit in strategic flexibility, even though it contradicted Korthok traditions of honorable direct engagement. Prime Calculate had been running continuous calculations while observing these unprecedented interactions between species that normally maintained strict separation. His quantum processors were discovering logical paradoxes that somehow produced functional solutions. The mathematical implications of interspecies collaboration exceed computational parameters for standard optimization models, he announced while displaying probability matrices that flickered between possible outcomes. Human methods introduce variables that cannot be quantified yet appear to improve overall system performance. High Chancellor Vexter watched from his elevated position as the carefully ordered structure of the council session dissolved into something that resembled the chaotic human concept of brainstorming. Species that had maintained formal diplomatic protocols for millennia were now engaging in direct conversation about ideas that challenged their fundamental assumptions. Is highly irregular, he transmitted to his Zephyrian aides through private telepathic channels. Council procedures have never included collaborative analysis sessions between different species. The humans are disrupting protocols that have maintained galactic order for thousands of years. But even as Vexter expressed concern about the breakdown of traditional procedures, he found himself intrigued by the results. The mixed species groups were generating approaches to the Gordian scenario that none of them had conceived individually. Lisa was working with Quex to develop biological adaptation strategies that combined mathematical optimization with flexible response protocols. Instead of trying to create perfect environments for each species, they were designing systems that could adjust automatically when conditions changed. Amy collaborated with Nexari engineers to create modular habitat designs that incorporated both alien efficiency and human adaptability. The resulting blueprints were less elegant than pure Nexari constructions, but far more versatile when faced with unexpected problems. Ryan worked with Korthok tactical specialists to develop security arrangements that combined overwhelming strength with strategic flexibility. Their hybrid approaches could respond to threats with decisive force when necessary while maintaining options for negotiation and compromise. Danny established communication protocols with Zephyrian telepaths that allowed rapid information sharing, while preserving individual privacy and decision-making autonomy. The new systems encouraged dialogue rather than consensus and produced agreements that satisfied everyone involved. The breakthrough came when Dr. Hayes suggested applying their collaborative methods directly to the 5 species in the Gordian scenario itself. Instead of trying to solve the crisis for them, what if they helped the species solve it themselves through direct communication and joint problem solving? The 5 species have been fighting over resources for thousands of years without ever sitting down together to discuss what they actually need, Lisa explained while pulling up communication records. They send formal demands through intermediaries, but they have never had the kind of conversation we are having right now. Quex ran calculations that showed how cooperation between the 5 species could produce resource allocation solutions that pure optimization had missed. Mathematical models improve significantly when they incorporate collaborative variables. Instead of assuming competitive zero-sum scenarios, Mirai used her telepathic abilities to analyze the psychological profiles of the 5 species and discovered that their conflicts were based more on fear and misunderstanding than actual incompatible needs. Many of their demands are defensive responses to perceived threats rather than absolute requirements for survival. Gruel examined the military aspects of the scenario and found that most of the resource conflicts could be resolved through coordinated logistics instead of competitive allocation. Joint operations often achieve objectives that individual forces cannot accomplish through superior strength alone. The council chamber had transformed into something resembling a human think tank with aliens from different species, working together on solutions that incorporated multiple perspectives and approaches. The formal hierarchy that usually defined galactic politics had given way to collaborative problem-solving. High Chancellor Vexter found himself facing a choice that no Zephyrian leader had ever confronted. The humans had not simply provided a new solution to an old problem, they had demonstrated a completely different way of thinking about problems that challenged the fundamental structure of galactic civilization. This session will be suspended while the Council considers the implications of human proposals, he announced with telepathic authority that carried across the chamber. All species representatives will have time to analyze these unprecedented developments before final judgment is rendered. But Jake Morrison could see in the alien faces around him that something irreversible had already happened. The rigid barriers between species had been crossed and new possibilities had been discovered. Through collaborative thinking that no individual group could have achieved alone, the humans had done more than solve an impossible puzzle. The final council session began 3 days later, but the chamber looked completely different from the rigid, formal structure that had greeted the human delegation a week earlier. Instead of each species sitting in isolated sections, the representatives had arranged themselves in mixed groups that continued the collaborative discussions that had started during the human presentation. High Chancellor Vexter stood at the central podium, but his usual air of absolute authority had been replaced by something that resembled uncertainty mixed with curiosity. The Zephyrian leader had spent the last 3 days in telepathic communion with his people, trying to process the implications of what they had witnessed. The Council has reached a decision regarding humanity's place in the Federation, he announced while his mental voice carried across the chamber to reach every species in their preferred communication mode. But first, we must address the larger questions that human methods have raised about how we approach galactic governance and interspecies cooperation. Jake Morrison sat with his crew in the front section reserved for the subjects of council judgment, but they no longer felt like defendants waiting for a verdict. The mixed species working groups that surrounded them had spent days developing new approaches to the Gordian scenario that incorporated human flexibility with alien capabilities. Lisa Hayes had been working with Nexari scientists and Zephyr biologists to create adaptation protocols that could help the 5 crisis species adjust to shared environments. Their combined expertise had produced solutions that none of them could have developed independently. The biological requirements analysis has been completed using collaborative methods suggested by human. Dr. Hayes announced Quex, the Nexari observer, whose quantum processors now incorporated uncertainty variables as standard parameters. Mathematical optimization combined with adaptive flexibility produces superior outcomes to either approach used separately. Amy Parker had been collaborating with alien engineers to design habitat systems that balanced efficiency with versatility. The new blueprints looked like hybrid creations that combined the elegant precision of Nexari technology with the robust adaptability of human engineering. Modular construction protocols allow real-time reconfiguration based on changing needs. An unexpected circumstances, reported the lead Nexari engineer, whose geometric form flickered with patterns of satisfaction. These designs sacrifice optimal efficiency to achieve superior resilience and operational flexibility. Ryan Blake had been working with contact military strategists to develop security arrangements that protected all 5 species while encouraging cooperation rather than competition. Their joint protocols combined overwhelming deterrent strength with diplomatic mechanisms for peaceful conflict resolution. Unified defense strategies provide maximum protection while minimizing resource allocation conflicts, declared War Chief Gruul, whose massive stone features showed approval that surprised his own tactical staff. Collaborative strength often exceeds the sum of individual capabilities when properly coordinated. Danny Walsh had established communication networks that allowed the 5 crisis species to engage in direct dialogue for the first time in their recorded history. The conversations had revealed that many of their conflicts were based on misunderstandings and assumptions rather than actual incompatible interests. Direct interspecies communication protocols have identified numerous opportunities for resource sharing and mutual assistance that formal diplomatic channels had never discovered. Danny reported while displaying message transcripts that showed growing cooperation between former enemies. Mirai, the Zephyrian telepath, approached the central podium with her consciousness touching the minds of representatives from multiple species simultaneously. The telepathic contact felt different from traditional Zephyrian broadcasting because it incorporated individual perspectives rather than seeking universal consensus. The 5 species in the Gordian scenario have begun implementing collaborative solutions developed through human-facilitated negotiations, she announced while her mental voice carried excitement that surprised even herself. Preliminary results exceed all mathematical projections for individual species survival and resource optimization. High Chancellor Vextar processed this information through enhanced cognitive networks that had been expanded to include input from non-Zephyrian sources for the first time in his species' history. The mental calculations that had always provided clear answers now incorporated variables that could not be quantified but clearly influenced outcomes. The humans have not simply solved an impossible problem, he said, while his telepathic authority carried new undertones of respect and curiosity. They have demonstrated that our fundamental assumptions about problem-solving and interspecies relations may be incomplete. Prime Calculix, Zenth floated forward with his crystalline surface, displaying probability matrices that included human concepts of adaptive flexibility and deliberate imperfection. Mathematical analysis confirms that human methods produce superior outcomes in scenarios involving uncertainty and multivariable optimization challenges. The Nexari leader paused, while quantum processors calculated implications that stretched far beyond the original Gordian scenario. These results suggest that galactic civilization could benefit from systematic integration of human collaborative approaches with existing specialized capabilities. War Chief Gruul stood from his massive stone chair, and his voice boomed across the chamber with authority that carried new respect for concepts he had previously dismissed as weakness. Korthak warriors have learned that strategic flexibility can achieve victories that pure strength cannot accomplish. Human methods deserve recognition as legitimate tools for achieving superior outcomes. The chamber filled with discussions as representatives from different species debated the implications of formally adopting human approaches to galactic governance. The rigid protocols that had maintained order for millennia were being challenged by evidence that collaborative flexibility might be more effective than specialized optimization. High Chancellor Vexter raised his hand for silence in the chamber, gradually quieted as hundreds of alien beings focused their attention on the decision that would determine not just humanity's fate but the future direction of galactic civilization. The Council hereby declares that humanity will not only remain in the Federation, but will be granted a new role that has never existed in galactic history, he announced while his mental voice carried authority mixed with anticipation. Will serve as the first diplomatic facilitation corps with responsibility for helping species work together on challenges that traditional methods have been unable to resolve. Jake Morrison felt a mixture of relief and responsibility settle on his shoulders like a weight that was both heavy and welcome. Humanity had not just survived the test but had been given a mission that would define their place in the galaxy for generations to come. The Gordian scenario will serve as the prototype for human-facilitated interspecies cooperation. Vexter continued while displaying holographic images of the 5 crisis species working together on their shared survival. Additional challenges that have stagnated under traditional approaches will be assigned to human mediation teams. Lisa Hayes realized that this decision would transform her career from studying alien biology to helping alien species understand each other. The prospect of facilitating communication between beings who had been isolated by their own specialization was both exciting and daunting. Amy Parker understood that human engineering would now be valued not for its efficiency but for its adaptability. The Federation would need flexible technologies that could work in situations that pure optimization could not handle. Ryan Blake saw opportunities to apply human military philosophy to galactic security challenges that required cooperation rather than conquest. The galaxy needed strategic thinkers who could find alternatives to overwhelming force. Danny Walsh knew that his communication skills would be essential for helping species that had forgotten how to listen to each other. The Federation required facilitators who could bridge gaps between incompatible worldviews. This new arrangement will require adjustments from all Federation members. Vexter acknowledged, while his telepathic voice carried undertones of uncertainty about the changes ahead. Human methods challenge established procedures, but their effectiveness cannot be disputed. The session concluded with something that had never happened in Council history. Instead of formal dismissal, the representatives continued talking to each other in mixed species groups that had formed during the collaborative sessions. The chamber buzzed with conversations between beings who had previously maintained strict diplomatic separation. Jake Morrison gathered his crew as they prepared to leave Nexus Prime. But their departure felt completely different from their arrival. They were no longer desperate humans trying to prove their worth to superior beings. They were partners in a galactic community that had discovered new possibilities through collaboration. So what happens now? Captain Lisa asked while watching alien beings work together on problems that had seemed impossible just days earlier. Jake looked around at the transformed council chamber where Nexari computers were processing Zephyrian telepathic insights while Korthok strategists